we know for a start that it's completely unfeasible. A 40-kilometer buffer zone along a 1,000-kilometer front, it doesn't take much of an effort of arithmetic to understand what an enormous commitment this would be to policing and protecting from anyone who was actually looking at supporting Ukraine. Plus, of course, it's no surprise that the Russians are in favor of it, because if it involves Ukrainian forces retreating 40 kilometers.
European leaders are considering plans for a 40-kilometer buffer zone in Ukraine as part of a potential peace negotiation with Russia. The proposal would create a demilitarized area along the front line, policed by European peacekeepers, with Britain and France supposedly making up the core of foreign troops. Moscow has reportedly embraced the idea, but it's unclear whether Kyiv would accept the plan, as it likely comes with territorial concessions. Keir Giles is a senior consulting fellow at Chatham House and the author of Who Will Defend Europe. Keir Giles, what exactly is being proposed here, and how feasible is it?
Well, like so much else that we're hearing about the negotiations on so-called security guarantees and who might be involved in enforcing them, it's all incredibly vague, but we know for a start that it's completely unfeasible. A 40-kilometer buffer zone along a 1,000-kilometer front, it doesn't take much of an effort of arithmetic to understand what an enormous commitment this would be to policing and protecting from anyone who was actually looking at supporting Ukraine. Plus, of course, it's no surprise that the Russians are in favor of it, because if it involves Ukrainian forces retreating 40 kilometers, pulling their forces back, that, of course, removes the entire front line of defenses that have kept Russia successfully at bay for the last 11 years. So it is another straw in the wind. It's another plan which is very unlikely to go anywhere. But it's in the context of this conversation that itself won't go anywhere, because all of these so-called security guarantees that European countries are talking about will only kick in, will only start to have effect after the fighting stops. And at the moment, there's no prospect of the fighting stopping.
But also there's talk here of foreign troops being sort of in this buffer zone wherever it would be. I mean, has anyone asked, has any country suggested that they would be happy to provide troops? I mean, we talk of French and British troops. I mean, didn't know we had any troops left.
Well, that's right. And when back in February, when we were in exactly the same situation, then there was another scramble to try to put together a coalition of the willing. Keir Starmer, first of all, said, yes, of course, British troops must be in the lead. And then 48 hours later, had a sudden U-turn and said, well, actually, no, we can't do that without US support. And the suspicion among people watching this is that somebody finally had an honest word with him about how much what's left of the British armed forces would be capable of doing without the Americans on side. We're still in that exact same situation more than 6 months later, despite all of the behind-the-scenes conversations that have gone on about what it might be possible for Western countries to actually insert into Ukraine. But we still don't have the starting condition that has been set, which is, once again, the fighting has to end before any of this happens.
But whose brainchild is this? I mean, a demilitarized zone, apart from, as you said, the enormous size of it. I mean, 40 kilometers along that. I mean, it's bigger than most countries. Would it help stabilize the conflict? I mean, all it would do, it would end up freezing Russian gains on the ground, effectively divide Ukraine. I mean, whose brainchild is this? Who thought this up?
Well, yes, it would be disastrous for everybody except Russia. So we shouldn't be surprised if this has actually come out from the Russian side as a suggestion which looks like something constructive but is actually a trap, which is a common theme to all of the initiatives for peace that we hear from Russia, including, of course, the ceasefire guarantees. There's a strong and established pattern of ceasefires being imposed on wars that Russia starts, with the terms of them being very unfavorable to the victim, obviously, but they look equable to the Western powers that are actually enforcing them. We've seen that in Georgia, we've seen that in Syria, we've seen that in Ukraine itself under the Minsk agreements before now. So the pattern has been very clearly established that Russia will offer something that countries that are desperate to end the fighting will seize that. But of course, Russia isn't desperate to end the fighting, it just wants to win the war.
What's the end game? I mean, not just in Ukraine. Are we looking at a new Iron Curtain?
Russia's endgame has been laid out fairly clearly by President Putin, including, for instance, when he was explaining the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The night before, he went on Russian television and explained that he wanted to rewrite the map of Eastern Europe. He said it was historic strategic mistakes 100 years beforehand that actually laid down what we think of as the borders of all of those countries neighboring Russia. So he's on a program to redo that map, and anybody that thinks this is only a problem for Ukraine has to conclude that actually somehow the rest of the countries that were formerly part of the Russian Empire get a pass and Putin won't be looking their way. So from the Russian side, it's very clear what they want. From the Western side, it's far more vague, and how exactly to insist on the interests and security and protection of Europe hasn't been as clearly laid out by those countries that say they are fully supporting Ukraine.
I was having a drink the other night with a friend who lives in Estonia, and obviously Baltic states have always been under threat of or a fear of some sort of Russian intervention. And he said that actually in the last 6 months they've slightly relaxed there just because Russia has been so wiped out militarily and sort of depleted in the Ukraine conflict. What's your view on that?
It's right that a lot of Russia's ground forces are tied up at the moment in Ukraine. Sadly, that doesn't mean that Russia doesn't have other means of doing damage. Now, the fighting in Ukraine would have to stop for those ground forces to be free to do something unpleasant against, for example, Estonia. But then there are other elements of Russia's armed forces that have been practicing for decades, delivering damage at immensely long ranges. And that, of course, includes the Navy with its long-range missiles, the Air Force with these long-range bombers to again launch cruise missiles from thousands of kilometers away. What that means is, sadly, Estonia is not the only target, and Western Europe is well within range of something that Russia might want to do to harm us.
Keir Giles, thank you very much for joining me.
Two questions on two separate issues. First of all, the drone and missile strikes that took place overnight in Ukraine. General Keith Kellogg, the president's special envoy, has described these attacks as egregious. Do you agree with that description, and do you view President Putin as an impediment to getting peace between these two countries?
Well, it's not about if I agree, it's about what the president thinks, and I know what the president thinks because I talked to him about this. He was not happy about this news, but he was also not surprised. These are two countries that have been at war for a very long time. Russia launched this attack on Kyiv, and likewise, Ukraine recently dealt a blow to Russia's oil refineries. They have taken out, as a matter of fact, 20% of Russia's oil refinery capacity over the course of their attacks throughout the month of August. So the president is continuing to watch this intently, and this killing, unfortunately, will continue as long as the war continues, which is why the president wants it to end. And that's why he's worked harder than anyone to end this war, which would have never started if he were president. But perhaps both sides of this war are not ready to end it themselves. The president wants it to end, but the leaders of these two countries need it to end and want it to end, must want it to end as well. And I think the president will make some additional statements on this later.